Congresswoman, I have dedicated my entire professional existence to imprisoning terrorists, and today I intend to trace the illicit capital from your district directly to the individuals plotting to execute American citizens. That solitary declaration detonated across the digital landscape with the concussive force of a grenade in a quiet library, racking up 60 million impressions in a mere 48 hours. Every major broadcast network replayed the clip on an endless loop until the specific phrasing dissolved into pure noise, the audible signature of a political trajectory collapsing in real time. Yet, to fully grasp why those specific remarks landed with such devastating impact, you must reverse the clock exactly 38 minutes to the instant before FBI Director Kash Patel dismantled one of the most polarizing figures in Congress. It was a systematic deconstruction, executed piece by piece, while the entire globe looked on in stunned silence. The J. Edgar Hoover Building in Washington, D.C., stands as a brutalist concrete citadel that has witnessed mob bosses sweat through their linens, terrorists break under interrogation, and foreign agents barter their nations for immunity. On this day, however, the fortress would observe a spectacle it had never encountered. A sitting United States Congresswoman marching in flanked by 5 attorneys, unknowingly walking out with her political destiny reduced to cinders. Ilhan Omar swept in as if she held the deed to the property, chin elevated and designer attire perfectly tailored, with a retinue of legal counsel and aides trailing her like a miniature procession. She had insisted this proceeding be open to the public, framing it as a chance to unveil the alleged racist persecution of a black Muslim woman by the FBI under the Trump administration. Earlier that morning, she had tweeted with defiant confidence, "They want to silence me, but they will fail as they always do." She possessed no inkling of what awaited her within those walls, where Kash Patel was already positioned when Omar's squad breached the heavy doors. On the table sat a single untouched glass of water and a stack of documents 6 inches high, with every color-coded tab representing a landmine primed for eventual detonation. He did not rise upon her entry, offered no smile, and extended no pleasantries, choosing instead to simply observe her claim the seat opposite him. He watched with the disciplined patience of a man who had spent a decade tracking extremists, possessing a profound understanding of how to wait for the precise instant to strike. As the room quieted and cameras were locked into focus, the lawyers arranged their yellow legal pads like infantrymen organizing for a skirmish. Patel leaned toward his microphone, his vocal tone tranquil and almost hushed. "You requested transparency, Congresswoman, so welcome to my domain." Omar's lead counsel immediately lodged an objection regarding the tone, but Patel ignored him entirely, simply flipping open his initial dossier to commence the demolition. Over the next 38 minutes, her legal team would plead for a recess 3 times. She would plead the Fifth Amendment twice, and she would face one inquiry she could never answer. This is the chronicle of the day Ilhan Omar encountered the man who hunted al-Shabaab and realized she was the next target on the list. Patel initiated the dialogue so gently that Omar's legal defense visibly loosened up, his voice conversational and carrying the friendly cadence of a colleague making small talk prior to a conference. "Congresswoman, before we delve into the grave issues, I wish to comprehend your philosophy, as you have constructed your entire political identity on combating graft and extracting money from politics." "Dark money corrupts democracy," he quoted, citing her mantra from the 2020 campaign, calling it a beautiful and truly inspiring sentiment. He paused, shuffling through the papers as though searching for a specific item, then suggested, "So, let us discuss how you embody that philosophy by following your own money." Omar adjusted her posture slightly, but held her composure, as she was on familiar ground, having fielded inquiries regarding campaign finance and survived FEC complaints before. However, Patel produced a dense binder of Federal Election Commission filings and began dealing them onto the table like a croupier spreading a hand of cards. The E Street Group, a political consulting firm headquartered in D.C., is managed by a man named Tim Minot, who is your current husband, correct? Omar nodded with caution, as Patel noted that between August 2018 and November 2020, her campaign paid the E Street Group $278 million, nearly $3 million funneled to her spouse's enterprise. He allowed that figure to hover in the atmosphere, noting that while paying a spouse's firm is not automatically criminal, it is certainly unusual and raises eyebrows. What becomes intriguing is the timeline, Patel said, producing another document derived from court filings in a divorce case involving Beth Minette. This is from the divorce complaint of Tim Minette's ex-wife, where she states under oath that on April 7, 2019, her husband confessed to being romantically involved with you. Omar's attorney leaned forward to argue that his client's personal life was irrelevant to campaign donations, but Patel did not raise his volume. Here is what is fascinating. On April 1, 2019, exactly 6 days before Tim Minette confessed his affair to his wife, your campaign commenced paying travel expenses to his company. There were 14 payments over the subsequent 10 weeks, totaling $70,000, and 6 of those transactions amounting to $12,673 were labeled merely as travel expenses with zero itemization. He tapped the documents, reminding her that FEC regulations mandate the itemization of travel costs, which she failed to provide. Beth Minette's divorce filing suggests those travel expenses were more related to his affair with Representative Ilhan Omar than with his actual work commitments, to use her sworn words in court. Omar's voice turned rigid as she retorted that the FEC investigated the complaint and dismissed it, finding no reason to believe she knowingly violated the statute. Patel emphasized every syllable, stating, "That is not synonymous with innocent, Congresswoman. That is synonymous with, we cannot prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you knew it was wrong. That is O.J. Simpson territory, where everyone observing the trial understood what transpired, but the jury simply could not certify it to the legal standard." He reclined slightly, declaring, "I am not a jury. I am the director of the FBI, and I do not require proof beyond a reasonable doubt. I only need to pursue the evidence." Omar attempted to interject, but Patel was already pivoting to a matter that had been substantiated, a violation Minnesota confirmed with a financial penalty and a repayment order. He produced state records showing that in 2014, she filed federal taxes jointly with Ahmed Hirsi, claiming him as her spouse, yet there was a significant problem. He looked up and stated, "You were still legally married to Ahmed Veysemid Nur Saeed Elmi, a completely different individual." The room fell silent as he detailed that she married Elmi in 2002 and filed for divorce in 2008, but never finalized the paperwork, meaning she committed tax fraud in 2014. "You claimed a joint filing status with a man who was not your legal husband," he said, placing the Minnesota documents down, noting the state found her guilty, and she repaid $3,500 in benefits plus a fine. "That is not a clerical error, Congresswoman. That is tax fraud, and you are a sitting member of Congress who has been adjudicated guilty of tax fraud by your own state." Omar's lawyer interjected that those matters were resolved years ago, and his client paid the required amounts, to which Patel replied, "No prosecution, no consequences beyond writing a check." He stood slowly and walked toward her side of the table, summarizing that she funneled millions to her boyfriend's firm and committed tax fraud, yet she built a career lecturing America on corruption. You positioned yourself as the moral conscience of Congress, he said, lowering his voice. But, Congresswoman, you do not fight corruption. You are the corruption. He returned to his seat, admitting that her personal finances were petty cash compared to the $1 billion stolen from starving children in her district. He opened a fresh dossier, stating, "Let us discuss feeding our future. Because while tax fraud is the opening act, round 2 involves money vanishing from children's mouths into criminals' pockets. Where that money went next is what will keep you awake at night, so stay right there," Patel said, standing to unveil a large easel holding a covered display board. He removed the cover to reveal an organizational chart resembling a conspiracy thriller, with names, photos, and logos connected by red lines sprawling like arteries. At the center, circled in heavy red marker, was the Minnesota 5th Congressional District, prompting Patel to ask, "Do you like puzzles, Congresswoman?" His voice had shifted, becoming harder and more focused, as he declared, "I love puzzles, and I have spent my entire career solving them, from terrorism financing to money laundering. Figuring out how $1 billion evaporates from a program designed to feed hungry children is a puzzle too, and this one leads somewhere very dark." Omar watched wearily as her lawyers scribbled notes on feeding our future, the largest pandemic fraud scheme in United States history, involving over $1 billion stolen from federal child nutrition programs. While criminals purchased mansions and luxury vehicles, children whose schools were closed went hungry, and Patel circled Minneapolis on the map as the epicenter. "The fraud was ubiquitous, but ground zero was right here in your district, run by your associates," he said, drawing a line to a photo of the Safari restaurant in Minneapolis. "You held your 2018 Congressional Victory Party there, and records show your campaign paid them over $10,000, he noted, before drawing an X through the photo. The owner, Salim Ahmed Saeed, claimed to serve 5,000 meals a day to children, but in reality, he pocketed $5 million to buy a mansion and designer clothes while kids starved. Your Victory Party venue is now a convicted fraud operation, and the host is going to federal prison," Patel said, ignoring her attempt to respond as he drew another line. He pointed to a photograph of a younger man standing next to Omar at a campaign event, identifying him as Guhad Hashi Saeed. "This is your campaign enforcer, the muscle in the Somali community who ran your get-out-the-vote operations and handled problems," Patel explained, producing a DOJ press release from the previous month. Guhad Hashi Saeed had pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit wire fraud and money laundering, claiming to feed 5,000 children a day from an apartment building. The FBI says he stole $3.24 million, Patel said, holding up the photo of Omar with her enforcer. And he is now the 52nd conviction in this case. Omar's voice rose as she claimed no knowledge of the fraud and returned donations, but Patel's response was immediate. "You didn't see fraud in your own backyard and report it. You ran to tears for cover." He walked back to the chart, stating that the situation gets worse because he hadn't yet revealed where the money went, and the room seemed to grow colder. "Congresswoman, I have spent my career prosecuting terrorists like Al-Qaeda and Al-Shabaab, and I know how they exploit charitable systems to fund operations." He produced a redacted Treasury Department document, reading Secretary Scott Bessent's words. "A lot of money has been transferred from the individuals who committed this fraud overseas to the Middle East and to Somalia. Treasury is tracking wire transfers from convicted defendants to bank accounts linked to financial networks associated with Al-Shabaab, the very organization I put people in prison for supporting." Omar's lead attorney stood abruptly to accuse Patel of implying terrorist connections without evidence, but Patel simply told him to sit down. I am not implying anything. I am stating facts about an ongoing investigation where your client's campaign workers and donors are convicted, he said calmly. He walked slowly toward Omar and asked her to think carefully before answering. Can you look into that camera and personally guarantee that none of the money stolen from your district funded terrorists who want to kill Americans? The silence was absolute until Omar's lawyer whispered urgently, and her face went pale as she stated, "My client invokes her Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination." Patel nodded slowly, noting that while the Fifth Amendment protects her from self-incrimination, it does not protect her from the truth, which has a way of surfacing. "One more round, and then we are done," Patel said, glancing at his watch to note that 31 minutes had passed, and Omar looked as if she had aged a decade. He opened his final folder to discuss patterns, explaining that in his line of work, patterns are how you catch terrorists and unravel money laundering. He spread documents across the table, citing her 2012 tweet. "Israel has hypnotized the world. May Allah awaken the people and help them see the evil doings of Israel." He then cited her February 2019 comment about support for Israel being all about the Benjamins, a reference to Jewish money controlling policy. "The House passed a resolution condemning anti-Semitism because of your words," he noted, looking up at her. "And your own party could not defend what you said." Omar strained to argue that her comments were taken out of context, but Patel leaned forward to offer his own context regarding his family's expulsion from Uganda by Idi Amin. "I grew up hearing about what that kind of language leads to, so do not lecture me about context," he said, moving on to the question she had never answered. He produced a timeline showing her marriage to Ahmed Nur Saeed Elmi in 2002, her divorce filing in 2008, and her child with Ahmed Hirsi in 2009. For years, investigative journalists have tried to answer a simple question: what was Ahmed Elmi's actual relationship to you? Some have alleged he was her brother, and that she married him to assist with immigration benefits, a claim she has denied but never disproven. Omar's attorney interjected that these were debunked conspiracy theories, but Patel sharply asked, "Debunked by whom?" He pointed out that she never released the marriage certificate or immigration documents to prove the relationship, instead calling everyone a racist. Patel stood slowly, positioning himself between Omar and the cameras to deliver what sounded like a prosecutor's closing argument. "Congresswoman, let me tell you a story about two kinds of immigrants. The first comes to America because they believe in this country and want to build something. My father was that kind of immigrant, expelled from Uganda with nothing, yet he raised a son who became the director of the FBI. The second kind of immigrant comes to America and sees opportunity not to build, but to take and to exploit the generosity that makes this country unique." He stopped directly in front of her, stating that America gave her safety, education, and a seat in Congress, the chance to shape the nation that saved her life. "And what did you give back?" he asked, counting on his fingers. "Blatant anti-Semitism, tax fraud, and a billion-dollar fraud ring operating in her district. You funneled money to your boyfriend while married to others, and now possibly money from your district is flowing to the terrorists who want to destroy this country." Omar sat frozen in the absolute silence of the room as Patel straightened his jacket. "You want to know the difference between us, Congresswoman?" he asked, turning to the cameras to say, "I spent my career protecting America, while you spent yours protecting your money and image." He gathered his documents and declared the hearing adjourned, but added that the investigation was just beginning and every penny would be traced. "I have spent my career putting terrorists behind bars, And today I followed the money from your district straight to the people who want to kill Americans." He walked out without looking back, and the clip hit 60 million views before most Americans finished their coffee the next morning. Within 48 hours, the clip had been remixed into memes and printed on shirts, while Omar's office released a statement calling it a racist witch hunt. For 11 days, Ilhan Omar vanished from public view, generating a deafening silence for a politician usually so active on social media. The storm did not pass. Instead, the Treasury announced an expanded investigation into Minnesota welfare fraud and wire transfers to overseas accounts. House Republicans introduced a resolution for her expulsion, while Democratic leadership issued a carefully worded statement declining to actively defend her. Polls showed a primary challenger pulling within 7 points, and her fundraising dropped 38% as major donors quietly redirected their capital. 3 weeks later, the E Street Group filed paperwork to dissolve, simply ceasing to exist as its digital footprint was erased. A month later, a reporter managed to catch Patel leaving FBI headquarters and asked if the hearing was merely political theater. Patel almost smiled, asking if convicting 52 people and tracing billions to Somalia, while a congresswoman's allies go to prison counts as theater. "You know what is actually political?" he asked, looking the other way because you are afraid of being called racist. He opened his car door and looked into the camera for the last time. "She can invoke the fifth until she runs out of breath, but facts do not care about your feelings, and neither do I." The silence that descended on Capitol Hill following Kash Patel's departure was not the tranquility of resolution, but the suffocating pressure of a barometer dropping before a hurricane. While the cable news pundits dissected the viral sound bites, the real machinery of justice had shifted gears from public spectacle to the quiet, lethal precision of forensic accounting. Inside the J. Edgar Hoover building, the political theater criticism had evaporated, replaced by a war room atmosphere where analysts from the Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control sat shoulder to shoulder with FBI counterterrorism agents. They were no longer looking for simple embezzlement or campaign finance violations. They were mapping a global labyrinth of shell companies, informal money transfer systems known as hawalas, and encrypted communications that spanned from Minneapolis to Nairobi. The investigation had mutated into something far more dangerous than a domestic fraud case, triggering tripwires in intelligence agencies that typically didn't care about school lunch programs. Patel's team had discovered that the Feeding Our Future scandal was merely the surface-level engine, a mechanism designed to siphon liquidity from the American taxpayer to fuel objectives that had nothing to do with nutrition. The breakthrough came not from a subpoena in Washington, but from an intercepted server in a nondescript office park in St. Cloud, Minnesota, where a mid-level accountant for the fraud ring had made a catastrophic error in digital hygiene. He had backed up a shadow ledger, a secondary set of books tracking the actual destination of the funds, to a cloud account linked to his personal email. When federal agents executed a warrant on that server, they didn't just find numbers. They found the connective tissue between a U.S. Congresswoman's political machine and entities on the terror watch list. The data revealed a sophisticated layering process where stolen lunch money was washed through real estate purchases, converted into cryptocurrency, and then dissolved into the opaque financial networks of the Horn of Africa. As the weeks ground on, the pressure on Ilhan Omar transformed from political heat into existential legal peril, forcing her to abandon her bunker strategy and return to the offensive. She staged a rally in the heart of her district, surrounding herself with supporters and framing the investigation as a weaponized assault on the immigrant community itself, a narrative designed to make any prosecution look like persecution. They are not investigating a crime. They are criminalizing our existence, she thundered from the podium, her voice echoing off the brick facades of Minneapolis, attempting to rally a base that was increasingly bewildered by the sheer scale of the allegations. However, the crowd was thinner than in years past, the energy dampened by the nagging question that Patel had planted in the public consciousness. Where did the $1 billion actually go? The optics were further complicated when local investigative reporters noticed that several key community leaders, formerly stalwarts of her coalition, were conspicuously absent from the stage. These leaders were absent because they were currently sitting in windowless rooms with federal prosecutors, negotiating plea deals that would trade their silence for their freedom. The dominoes were falling in reverse order, starting from the street-level fraudsters who bought Lamborghinis and moving steadily upward toward the political architects who provided the cover. One cooperating witness, a former campaign bundler who had funneled tens of thousands of dollars to Omar's operation, provided testimony that shattered the plausible deniability defense. He detailed specific meetings where the mechanics of the fraud were discussed not as criminal acts, but as community wealth building, a euphemism that allowed political operatives to look the other way while the treasury was looted. He alleged that Omar's inner circle was aware that the meal count numbers were physically impossible, yet they continued to pressure state education officials to release the funds, using accusations of racism as a battering ram to overcome regulatory oversight. Meanwhile, the Treasury Department's findings began to leak, not to the press, but through classified briefings to the House Intelligence Committee, fundamentally altering the calculus for Democratic leadership. The trace on the wire transfers had hit a terrifying terminal point. A logistics company in Mogadishu known to facilitate supply lines for al-Shabaab militias. The realization that American taxpayer dollars intended to feed children during a pandemic might have purchased ammunition used against U.S. allies in East Africa sent a chill through the corridors of power. It was no longer a matter of protecting a progressive squad member. It was a matter of national security liability, and the distance between Omar and her party leadership grew into a chasm. The Speaker of the House, usually quick to defend members against partisan attacks, offered a curt no comment when asked if Omar should remain on the Foreign Affairs Committee, a silence that screamed louder than any condemnation. Patel, operating with the relentless momentum of a man who knows he has the winning hand, authorized a series of synchronized raids that targeted the professional class facilitating the scheme, the lawyers, the accountants, and the consultants. These were not the flashy raids of the initial investigation, but surgical strikes aimed at the gatekeepers who created the corporate veils hiding the money flow. Among the seized assets was a laptop belonging to a senior partner at a boutique law firm that handled Omar's divorce and her husband's business dealings. The encryption on the drive was military-grade, but the password was eventually provided by a paralegal terrified of becoming an accessory to terrorism financing. What the FBI forensics team found on that drive connected the travel expenses mentioned in the initial hearing directly to cash withdrawals made in cities known as hubs for terror finance. The narrative took a darker turn when international intelligence partners shared surveillance footage from a hotel lobby in Istanbul showing one of the convicted "feeding our future" ringleaders meeting with an operative linked to the spectacular attack on the Westgate shopping mall. The timeline of the meeting coincided perfectly with a massive infusion of cash from the Minnesota fraud scheme, creating a circumstantial bridge that was becoming impossible to ignore. Patel didn't need to prove that Omar personally ordered the transfer. He only needed to prove that her negligence was so profound and her political protection so absolute that she became the essential enabler of a terror financing pipeline. The legal theory was shifting from simple fraud to material support, a charge that carries a weight and a stigma that no amount of spin or Twitter activism can survive. Back in Minnesota, The political ground was shifting beneath Omar's feet as her primary challenger, a pragmatic former prosecutor, began running ads that simply listed the convictions and the dollar amounts. The ads didn't mention religion or race. They just asked who was watching the store. The simplicity of the attack was devastating because it bypassed the identity politics defense and struck directly at the core competency of a representative. Internal polling showed a collapse in support among suburban women and union workers, two pillars of the Democratic coalition who were appalled by the theft from children. The local Star Tribune, which had previously endorsed her, ran a blistering editorial demanding she release her personal financial records to clear the air, a demand she steadfastly refused. The climax of this phase of the investigation arrived on a Tuesday morning in November, just weeks before the election certification, when the Department of Justice unsealed a superseding indictment. This document did not name Omar as a defendant yet, but it referred to Public Official A 19 times, describing a pattern of interference that blocked state auditors from investigating the fraud sooner. The indictment detailed how Public Official A had sent threatening letters to the Minnesota Department of Education, accusing them of discrimination whenever they attempted to verify the meal counts. The implication was clear to anyone with a high school civics education. The FBI was building a RICO case, a racketeering charge usually reserved for the mafia, arguing that the political machine and the fraud ring were one and the same. Patel stepped up to the microphone for a press conference that the entire nation had tuned in to watch, his demeanor stripping away any remaining veneer of political theater. He didn't gloat. He didn't raise his voice. He simply laid out the new evidence with the clinical detachment of a surgeon diagnosing a terminal malignancy. "We have established that the fraud was systemic," he began, looking directly into the camera lens. "We have established that the proceeds went to our enemies. And now we have established that the oversight was deliberately crippled from the inside." He paused, allowing the gravity of the accusation to settle over the room. "The argument that this was a mistake is no longer credible. The evidence suggests it was a design." The question period was dominated by inquiries about Public Official A, and while Patel refused to confirm the identity, he offered a statement that would define the next chapter of the saga. "There is no immunity for betrayal," he said, his eyes scanning the press corps. "When you take an oath to the Constitution, you are not just promising to show up to vote. You are promising to protect this nation from enemies, foreign and domestic. If our investigation proves that an elected official acted as a shield for those who wish us harm, the Department of Justice will not hesitate to cross the constitutional threshold, to hold them accountable." The message was received loud and clear in Omar's office, where the blinds were drawn and the phones had been unplugged. As the sun set over Washington, the lights in the FBI headquarters remained blazing, a beacon of industriousness in a city often paralyzed by gridlock. The Somalia link was no longer a theory. It was a file growing thicker by the hour, fed by wiretaps, bank records, and the confessions of men who had realized too late that they were pawns in a much larger game. Ilhan Omar remained defiant on social media, reposting messages of support from radical groups. But in the private dining rooms of D.C., the eulogies for her career were already being spoken in hushed tones. The money had been followed, the trail had been mapped, and the hunter was now standing on the porch, waiting for the warrant that would bring the entire house of cards crashing down. The story was far from over, but the ending was beginning to look inevitable, written in the indelible ink of bank ledgers that never lie. The winter wind that whips down Pennsylvania Avenue carries a specific chill reserved for the powerful when they realize their immunity has expired, and for Ilhan Omar, that chill arrived with the unsealing of a grand jury subpoena that demanded not just documents, but the surrender of her personal electronic devices. The distinction between public official A and the Congresswoman from Minnesota had eroded to the point of transparency, dissolving under the relentless acid of the FBI's forensic timeline. Kash Patel had orchestrated the investigation like a master chess player, slowly removing the pawns and knights, the aides, the fundraisers, the community liaisons, until the Queen stood exposed on an empty board. The subpoena was the checkmate move, a legal demand that stripped away the last vestiges of congressional privilege and forced a confrontation between her public narrative and her private communications. In the halls of Congress, colleagues who had once jostled for photo opportunities with the famous squad member now diverted their eyes in the corridors, terrified that the radioactive fallout of the investigation might contaminate their own careers. The catalyst for this final collapse was a breakthrough by the FBI's cryptographic unit, which had managed to bypass the encryption on a secured messaging app used by the inner circle of the Feeding Our Future conspiracy. The recovered chat logs were not merely incriminating, they were catastrophic, painting a picture of a criminal enterprise that viewed the federal government not as a sovereign entity, but as a host organism to be parasitized. In one exchange dated 3 days before the initial FBI raids, a top campaign aide asked if the overseas transfers were untraceable, to which a direct response from Omar's personal account read, "The community handles its own. Focus on the auditors." That single sentence flashed across the screens of investigators at the J. Edgar Hoover building was the smoking gun that transformed a case of negligence into a case of active conspiracy. It proved that she wasn't just a passive beneficiary of political support from fraudsters. She was an active participant in the cover-up, fully aware that the money was moving through illicit channels to destinations that would horrify the American public. As the primary election approached, the political machinery that had insulated her for years began to dismantle itself with ruthless efficiency, driven by the instinct for self-preservation that defines Washington. The Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, reading the internal polls that showed her support cratering among independent voters, quietly suspended all ad buys in her district, signaling to the sharks in the water that she was no longer a protected species. Her primary challenger, emboldened by the silent approval of the party establishment, hammered the airwaves with the simple, devastating question, where did the $1 billion go? The racism defense, which had served as her iron dome against criticism for her entire career, finally failed to intercept the incoming fire because the victims of the fraud were themselves Somali immigrants, mothers who expected food for their children and received nothing, while campaign donors bought real estate in Nairobi. The narrative had flipped. She was no longer the champion of the marginalized, but the aristocrat who allowed them to be robbed. Election night in Minneapolis was less a contest and more a coronation of reality, as the returns began to trickle in, showing a landslide defeat that defied the usual partisan gravitation of the district. There were no victory parties, no triumphant speeches, only a sullen concession delivered from a cramped campaign office where the staff looked more like mourners than political operatives. Omar blamed the right-wing media machine and dark money interests for her loss, refusing to acknowledge the federal indictment that hung over the proceedings like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. But the voters had spoken with a clarity that pierced the fog of identity politics, rejecting the corruption in numbers that made the margin of defeat impossible to spin. As the networks called the race for her challenger, the immunity that protects a sitting member of Congress began to tick down like a countdown clock, set to expire the moment her term officially ended. However, the Department of Justice, armed with the new evidence from the decrypted chats, decided not to wait for the ceremonial transition of power. 2 days after her electoral defeat, agents from the Washington field office arrived at her D.C. apartment, not with a battering ram, but with a politely worded request for her to surrender to the U.S. Marshal Service. The indictment had been unsealed, revealing 23 counts including wire fraud, conspiracy to commit money laundering, and, most damning of all, gross negligence in the safeguarding of funds benefiting foreign adversaries. The charge of material support for terrorism was held in reserve, a strategic sword of Damocles designed to compel cooperation in identifying the ultimate recipients of the funds in East Africa. The sight of a United States representative being processed at a federal courthouse, fingerprinted and photographed, was a searing image that burned itself into the national retina, marking the definitive end of an era of performative politics. Inside the interrogation room, the dynamic had shifted profoundly from the defiant posture she held during the committee hearing. There were no cameras, no grandstanding, only the cold, hard surfaces of a room designed to extract truth. Kash Patel did not conduct the interview himself. He watched from behind the glass, letting the career prosecutors lay out the evidence with the methodical precision of accountants auditing a bankruptcy. They played the audio recordings of her conversations with the convicted fraudsters. They showed the flow charts tracing the money from the Treasury to the Hawala dealers. They laid out the flight manifests of couriers carrying cash in suitcases. Confronted with the undeniable geometry of her own corruption, the defiance evaporated, replaced by the terrified silence of someone realizing that the Fifth Amendment cannot protect you when the evidence is independent of your testimony. She was offered a choice: accept a plea deal that would involve significant prison time and full allocution, or roll the dice with a jury that would see exactly what the FBI had seen. The reverberations of her fall extended far beyond the borders of Minnesota, triggering a cascade of audits into similar nonprofit networks across the country that had operated under the guise of social justice. The Feeding Our Future model was revealed to be a franchise, a blueprint for fraud that had been replicated in varying degrees in other districts where political patronage shielded criminal activity from oversight. Patel's investigation became the textbook case for a new era of federal law enforcement, one that refused to accept cultural sensitivity as an excuse for the theft of public funds. The Treasury Department implemented rigorous new protocols for international wire transfers, essentially freezing the financial pipelines that had allowed diaspora politics to intermingle with terror financing. The system, having been tested to its breaking point, was slowly calcifying into something harder, less trusting, and infinitely more watchful. In the weeks following her arraignment, the silence from her former allies was the loudest sound in Washington. The squad disbanded in spirit, if not in name, as remaining members scrambled to distance themselves from the radioactive toxicity of the case. The media, which had once heralded her as a trailblazer, began running retrospectives, questioning how so many red flags had been ignored for so long, engaging in a collective act of revisionist history. The narrative shifted from the first refugee congresswoman to the billion-dollar grifter, a cautionary tale about the dangers of elevating symbols over substance. The tragedy, as noted by many observers, was not just the fall of a politician, but the betrayal of the very community she claimed to represent. Honest immigrants who would now face double the scrutiny because of her crimes. She had climbed the ladder of the American dream and then set it on fire, leaving everyone else stuck on the ground floor to deal with the ashes. The final act of the drama played out in a federal courtroom in St. Paul, where Ilhan Omar stood before a judge to enter a plea, stripped of the designer suits and the entourage, looking smaller than she ever had on television. When the judge asked for her plea to the count of conspiracy to defraud the United States, her voice was barely a whisper, a stark contrast to the booming rhetoric of her rallies. "Guilty, Your Honor," she said. two words that legally severed her from the institution she had served and sealed her fate as a federal convict. In the back of the courtroom, Kash Patel stood quietly, observing the conclusion of the mission he had announced months earlier, his face unreadable but his presence undeniable. He didn't stay for the sentencing remarks. He simply buttoned his jacket, turned on his heel, and walked out into the cold Minnesota afternoon. The job done, the money followed, and the bomb in the library finally diffused. As he exited the courthouse, a lone reporter shouted a question over the wind, asking if he felt vindicated by the guilty plea and the collapse of her career. Patel paused on the steps, looking out at the gray skyline, and for a moment, the weight of the years of investigation seemed to lift from his shoulders. Vindication is for people who have something to prove. I only had a job to do, he replied, his voice carrying clearly over the microphones. We proved that in America, you can be a refugee, you can be a congresswoman, you can be a celebrity, but you cannot be above the law. He walked to his waiting car, the door closing with a definitive thud, leaving behind a legacy that would serve as a warning to anyone who believed that political power was a license to steal from the people. The story of Ilhan Omar was over, but the message it sent would echo through the corridors of Washington for generations to come. The sentencing hearing was not a dialogue, but a eulogy for a public trust betrayed, held in a courtroom that felt less like a hall of justice and more like a sterile operating theater where a tumor was being excised from the body politic. The judge, a federal appointee with a reputation for searing intellect and zero patience for political grandstanding, stared down at the defendant with eyes that had seen every variation of human greed, yet seemed particularly offended by the unique architecture of this specific crime. You did not steal from a bank, which is insured, or from a corporation, which can absorb the loss. You stole from the mouths of the most vulnerable children in your own community to finance a lifestyle of jet-setting opulence and radical cosplay, he intoned, his voice devoid of anger but heavy with a disappointment that crushed the air out of the room. The prosecution had requested 15 years, a sentence intended to send a shockwave through the non-profit industrial complex. But the defense had argued for leniency based on her historic service and cooperation regarding the terror financing channels. The judge paused for a long, agonizing minute, the silence stretching until it became a physical weight, before delivering a sentence of 12 years in federal prison, followed by immediate deportation proceedings upon release, stripping away the citizenship she had allegedly obtained through fraudulent means decades prior. The transfer to the Federal Correctional Institution in Aliceville, Alabama, was a logistical operation conducted with the secrecy of a military extraction, designed to prevent both protests and potential rescue attempts by the radical fringes that still viewed her as a martyr. Stripped of the designer suits, the carefully curated makeup, and the entourage that had functioned as her Praetorian Guard, Ilhan Omar was reduced to a number, inmate 49200-041, a transformation that was as psychological as it was physical. The intake process was brutal in its banality. There were no cameras to capture her defiance, no Twitter feed to spin the narrative. Only the cold, fluorescent reality of squat and cough searches and the issuing of ill-fitting khaki uniforms. For a woman who had thrived on the dopamine rush of global attention, the sudden, absolute anonymity of the penitentiary was a punishment far more severe than the confinement itself. A silence that echoed louder than any cheering crowd she had ever addressed. She was placed in a segregated housing unit for her own protection, a solitary existence where the only audience she had left was the reflection in a polished steel mirror, forcing her to confront the reality of the choices that had led her from the halls of power to a 6x8 concrete box. Back in Washington, the information she provided as part of her plea deal was detonating across the intelligence community, validating the darkest suspicions that Kash Patel had harbored since the investigation began. She had given up the names of the Hawaladars, the informal money brokers, in Nairobi and Mogadishu who had acted as the bridge between the Minnesota fraud ring and the Al-Shabaab logistical network. The intel led to a joint operation between U.S. Special Forces and Kenyan intelligence that dismantled a financial node responsible for funding suicide bombings across East Africa, proving definitively that the Feeding Our Future money had indeed purchased explosives used to kill innocents. The revelation that a sitting U.S. Congresswoman had, through willful blindness and corruption, acted as a primary financier for a designated terror group caused a diplomatic earthquake, forcing the State Department to completely overhaul its vetting procedures for refugee resettlement and aid distribution. The Omar Rule, as it came to be known in regulatory circles, mandated a forensic level of transparency for any NGO operating in conflict zones, effectively closing the loophole that had allowed billions to leak out of the U.S. Treasury for decades. Kash Patel used the momentum of the conviction to launch a sweeping purge of the Department of Justice officials who had previously protected the fraud ring, turning the political theater accusation back on his detractors with lethal precision. He initiated internal affairs investigations into the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota, demanding to know why the initial reports of fraud in 2020 were suppressed, and who had issued the stand-down orders that allowed the theft to continue for another 2 years. The investigation revealed a rot that went deep into the administrative state, exposing a network of bureaucrats who prioritized political correctness over law enforcement, fearing the label of Islamophobia more than they feared the loss of taxpayer billions. Patel's press conferences became must-watch television, not for their theatrics, but for the relentless, monotone recitation of facts that exposed the complicity of the permanent political class. He wasn't just cleaning house, he was demolishing the foundation of identity politics that had allowed corruption to fester under the guise of diversity, establishing a new precedent where background and ethnicity offered zero shelter from the law. The cultural impact of the saga was perhaps its most enduring legacy, as the Squad and the progressive movement that had birthed it fractured under the weight of the betrayal. The Somali community in Minneapolis, initially defensive, began to undergo a painful but necessary reckoning, realizing that their blind loyalty to a figurehead had allowed criminals to rob their own children and tarnish their reputation globally. New leaders emerged from the wreckage, pragmatic men and women who rejected the victimhood narrative in favor of accountability, working with federal authorities to recover what assets they could and rebuild the shattered trust with their neighbors. The Feeding Our Future scandal became a case study in business schools and law enforcement academies alike. A perfect storm of how altruism can be weaponized by predators when oversight is paralyzed by political sensitivity. The district eventually elected the former prosecutor who had challenged her, a boring, methodical public servant who promised nothing but balanced books and paved roads, signaling a return to the fundamentals of governance that the district had abandoned for the sugar high of celebrity politics. 1 year into her sentence, a journalist was granted rare access to interview Omar. Finding a woman who looked decades older than the vibrant figure who had once graced the cover of Rolling Stone, she spoke in hushed tones, stripped of the fiery rhetoric, admitting that the system she had railed against was the only thing that had actually worked, catching a fraud that she had been too arrogant to see or too compromised to stop. When asked if she missed Congress, she looked at the cinder-block walls and replied that she missed the delusion of control, the belief that she could bend reality to her will simply by speaking it into a microphone. She had learned the hard way that while politics is a game of perception, the law is a game of facts, and facts do not bend for anyone, not even for those who believe they are on the right side of history. The interview was read by millions, but it sparked little sympathy. The public had moved on, their attention consumed by the next crisis, leaving her to fade into the ghostly annals of disgraced politicians who flew too close to the sun on wings made of stolen money. Kash Patel, having completed the mission that defined his tenure, eventually resigned from the FBI to return to the private sector. But his shadow loomed large over the institution he left behind. He had proven that the machinery of justice, though rusted and slow, could still be made to function if there was a will to drive it, and that no amount of media cover could protect a criminal once the forensic accountants started following the money. On his final day, he walked past the photo of the bomb in the library, the quote that had started it all, framed on his office wall, a reminder that the truth is often destructive before it is redeeming. He didn't look back at the Hoover building as he left. He simply got into his car and drove into the Virginia traffic, just another commuter in a city of secrets, knowing that somewhere in a federal cell in Alabama, the silence was finally absolute. The story of the billion-dollar heist was over, but the lesson remained etched in the granite of the Capitol. In the end, the ledger always balances, and the bill always comes due.